Are we okay now?
Yes, sir.
So a very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all on this webinar on economic reforms in North Korea, likelihood and policies. Well, North Korean economy is still stuck in the old Marxist or communist framework. Even the Cuban economy has been changing after the Castros. There has been food crisis in North Korea. India has been off and on donating food through World Food Program, normally worth about $1 million at a time. And last July also, July 2020, we had donated food worth $1 million. And appeals are made directly by the North Korean government to our government. Then lately, Chairman Kim Jong-un has been surprisingly candid about the poor economic performance of North Korea and the economic hardships being faced by North Koreans. He has also been reportedly emotional at one point. Perhaps some tears also came out of his eyes when he talked about the hardships. And he showed the human face of his personality at that time. I was in Seoul 2008 to 11. At that time, relations between North and South Korea were very tense. There was second nuclear test of North Korea in 2009 when I was there. Cheonan submarine sinking took place March 2010. And the government there was Senuri Party, Lee Myung-bak, quite right-wing. And I recall, of course, all the time in the diplomatic corps, talk was about North Korea. And the Chinese ambassador used to say that the Chinese have been repeatedly advising the North Korean leadership to go for economic reforms and follow the Chinese way. But the North Koreans say that the Chinese have strayed from the true path, and he used to chuckle. And my Russian colleague was an old CPSU veteran, Communist Party of Soviet Union. And he used to say, oh, no, these North Koreans are not communists at all. They are like an Oriental tyranny. These were his words. They were like an Oriental tyranny. And of course, the Russians wanted this railroad to come through from South Korea through North Korea to Russia for economic benefit and investment. They wanted Korean investments in Russian Far East. Well, of course, all that did not happen. But when one talks about economic reforms have their own logic, and any conscious leadership has to ultimately, along with regime survival or whatever, has to have some concern for the welfare of the people. And we also had reforms under some very trying circumstances in 1990s in our own Indian economy. So either the leadership has to be convinced of economic reforms, as perhaps happened in India in 1990s, or there has to be great questioning from the grassroots, from the people. As what happened in East Europe, pre-Soviet Union collapse, because of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and a lot of people from East Europe used to travel to West. And so there was a great awareness among the people of East Europe pre-91 that there is a huge economic gap between and welfare, etc., quality of living between the people of West and East, and there was some pressure on the leadership. Then, of course, Soviet Union collapsed and things happened. But North Korea is different. North Korea is a closed society. It's very difficult to think of a scenario where there could be pressure from the below. from below. So how can reforms be initiated? Which is the interested group? And that is where we have today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Frank Rudger of University of Vienna, who has been studying this, who has been working on this. And Dr. Rudger he's professor of East Asian economy and society in University of Vienna, and he grew up in East Germany of sort of Soviet times, spent 5 years in Moscow as a student, and 1 semester at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang. And he has some very innovative and practical thoughts on how reforms could perhaps be introduced or could come in North Korea. So over to you, Dr. Frank. Maybe about 30-35 minutes. Kindly speak for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll have brief Q&A if you are okay.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for the very kind introduction, and again also for giving me a chance to share some of my thoughts with you and the distinguished audience here. Let me just share my screen first. Okay, that should be working now, hopefully. Yes, so what I'm going to talk about is indeed, as you just said, the likelihood of economic reforms in North Korea and how that could probably be done in terms of external influence. Frankly, having been in this field for such a long time, it's not the first time that this question is being asked, and it has been debated quite a lot. What I think is missing is a systematic analysis of the whole thing. And this is what I'm going to try to suggest today based on the CRE model. CRE stands for Comprehensive Reform Equation. Okay, this should now move. Okay, this is, in case you have to leave early, that's kind of the summary of the whole talk on one page. I think most of you will agree, North Korea's economy is in trouble. I'll say a few words on that. There are many reasons for that, one of which is the system. I think I'm going to talk about long-term, mid-term, and short-term reasons, but the underlying reason for all those difficulties that we see emerging in North Korea is really the economic system, and therefore a change of the system is really key to solving all the problems. Please note that I didn't say a change of regime, I said a change of the system, which is not necessarily the same thing. I will then look a little bit at what reforms actually are, because my favorite quote from the Chinese philosopher Confucius is actually about the rectification of names. Very often I have the impression that people talk about reforms and come up with really good arguments, but they are not really talking about the same thing. So I think we need a clarification of what reform actually really means. And according to the definition I use, based on Janos Konai, there have not been any actual reforms in North Korea. Many changes, but no reforms. Concerning impacting, influencing, nudging North Korea into certain directions, many things have been tried over the years, arguably without really the desired results. Just look at what you mentioned, Ambassador, the nuclear program of North Korea, the first nuclear test 2006, then followed by a test 2009, 2013, and so on and so on. And that happened despite all the efforts to prevent that. This is just one example out of many. So my question is, if all these things have not really worked, what can actually be done to increase the chances or likelihood of reforms? In this regard, the model I'm going to introduce is really offering a way to approach this issue. It doesn't really give all the answers, but it gives you a way to find them. And I think it gives you a better way to find them compared to what has been done so far, where we look at the whole issue as one big problem. I try to break it down into smaller and more manageable portions. This is what you do as a scholar, you know, if you have a complex issue, you try to kind of not simplify it, but break it down into simpler issues that are still complicated enough, but at least not such a big monster as the big question itself has been in the beginning. And for doing so, the CRE model looks at, very simply speaking, costs and benefits of reform and non-reform. And it does so for 4 groups within North Korean society: leader, elite, middle class, and people. As I will tell you later, those 4 groups are not the only way how you can divide North Korea's society for analytical purposes. But in any case, I believe you have to do this somehow, because there is not just one North Korea. It's 25 million people, and they all do not necessarily have the same ideas, the same preferences, and the same power, the same means, and therefore they should probably also be addressed separately. The key results, again, that's kind of, stealing the final effect of this whole presentation. The final results are that the most effective ways to influence reforms in North Korea, to make them more probable, would be to target the elite and the middle class. So you see the leader is missing here, and the people are missing there as well. In a way, this is echoing what the ambassador just said in his introductory remarks. A grassroots movement is always nice to have, but it's not necessarily the thing that we should really place most of our bets on. And as you see, the leader is also missing here. So I'm a big fan, actually, of the summit meetings between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, but for different reasons. Certainly, if you expect this to lead to some major breakthrough on the reform front, of course, that would be pretty naive. Also, in terms of the actual policies, once you target those 2 groups, I think there are 2 things that seem to be most promising. That is, on one hand, increase their perception of benefits that they would receive if reforms would take place, and reduce their perceived losses from reforms. So those are, out of the many available options about which I'm going to talk in a minute, these are the 2 most promising. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what I'm going to do today. And now let me just go through all this in a bit more detail. So let's start with the status quo in North Korea being in crisis. We have a combination of long, midterm, and short-term problems that North Korea's economy is suffering from. In the long run, it's pretty well known and well understood. It's central planning and state ownership. We know the effects this leads to. Again, we have lots of empirical evidence on that from Eastern Europe. There are many studies that have been written about this. The one that I prefer is that by Janusz Kornai on the socialist system, published in 1992, Princeton University Press. If there's one book you need to read about the socialist system, that would be really my recommendation. There is something that by now is already, I think, a midterm challenge, because economic sanctions have been going on for quite a long time, and there's no doubt that they are suffocating North Korea's economy. They are having an effect. It would be naive to say that they have no impact whatsoever. The problem is they don't have the desired effect, but they certainly contribute to North Korea's crisis. And then finally, the pandemic. Next year, it could be another short-term threat. Right now, it's COVID, which is reducing what is left of international economic exchange that North Korea had after the sanctions. If you look at the graph to the lower left, again, the details don't matter. It's a bit small, but what matters is the direction of the curve. And as you see, it really goes down. By now, trade levels based on the South Korean data from KOTRA, trade levels are down to a level below the economic crisis in the late 1990s, actually. So when you talk about the arduous march and the Great Famine in North Korea and all that, it corresponded with the collapse of North Korea's foreign trade. And now, in terms of numbers, the situation is much worse. Now, when we talk about trade, there is a little grain of salt. Well, there are many grains of salt, actually, that we have to take this with. One is the question of how important trade actually is for North Korea's overall economic performance, because the country has been working hard to achieve economic independence, and also in many fields it is working on a very basic level. So on that level of development, trade isn't really that influential, but it does matter and it does hurt. And obviously the pink elephant in the room here in terms of trade is the import of oil. crude oil, which North Korea so far does not produce by itself, but also many other inputs that you would need for crucial sectors of the economy, not just the defense sector, but also agriculture, industry, technology, and so on. The graph to the right-hand side shows you that numbers coming out of North Korea that I regularly interpret as at least a proxy for North Korea's economic growth are also not really looking very good. That's the budget, the state budget numbers published annually by the North Koreans. And as you see here, the curve is also going down. There's actually not budget, it's the growth rates. And they are now officially at the lowest level since the year 2000. And that is also supporting the notion that North Korea is undergoing a very severe crisis at the moment. And as you see, the curve falls very steeply. So we also see the effect of what very likely to be the effect of the COVID pandemic. Okay, so North Korea is in crisis. How does North Korea react to that? Do they now embrace reforms as a response? The answer is no, they don't. The Kim Jong-un speech at the 8th Congress of the party in January is one example out of many. This message has then been repeated a couple of times on various occasions. And it shows us that their strategy is not reform. It's rather taking steps back, looking at import substitution, basically born out of necessity. If you have no trade, of course, you have to substitute what you need to import as much as you can. It's also not necessarily a new strategy, right? This is what they've been at least officially saying for decades, although the implementation did actually vary over the years. What I find even more concerning is the strengthening of the state's role in the economy. Again, I could speak for about an hour providing you examples and details on that. Just have a few here, a few quotes also from speeches by Kim Jong-un and the Prime Minister. So the state's role in the economy, of course, comes at the expense of non-state actors, including market forces. This is not saying that the markets are completely gone, but most analysts agree that their role has been severely limited, also compared to the previous years. So no reforms have been announced. On the contrary, actually, we see signs of a tightening of ideological control and increased political repression, also trying to, again, turn back the wheel. The problem we have here is that the reason for most of the concerns that exist about North Korea is the actual system. Those concerns include weapons of mass destruction, human rights, and also the humanitarian suffering of the people if the economy is doing badly. But the change of the system can only happen through reforms. What is a reform? This is, I think, necessary to define before we continue so that you know what I mean when I talk about reforms. As I said, I'm referring to János Kornai's work here, who argues that not every change in economic policy is actually a reform. There have been many such changes. I have a few of them on the next slide, but they have not been reforms. They are what Kornai calls a perfection measure. Perfection, trying to make the system work. It has been mentioned, I have myself an experience of having lived 21 years in a socialist country, so I know pretty well what that means, You see the problems, of course. I mean, people aren't blind. And you mentioned that Kim Jong-un himself has been very critical, self-critical of the situation in North Korea. The question is not being aware of these problems. The question is how you solve them and where you see the actual root cause. And what we see is changes in administrative units, campaigns, and so on. In the socialist bloc in East Germany, for example, you had a new economic system of planning and guidance, etc., which was tried out for a while in other socialist countries as well. So you introduce certain elements of what you could probably call a market economy, but you leave the system in place, and that's the problem. So a reform, in order to be a reform, must fulfill these three requirements that you see here on the slide. It must affect key elements of the system. So in a way, you have to have private ownership of means of production. Here we talk also about broad and deep changes, not just one company that is private. This is certainly not enough. And coordination should be shifted, not necessarily entirely, but again, broadly and deeply from the state to the market, so that companies can decide what to produce, how much to produce, at what price to sell, etc., rather than having quotas and prices and goods and qualities determined by the state. And yeah, a point that is not part of Kornai's model, but part of my understanding of a reform, also based on my research, is that I think there needs to be some kind of an explicit announcement of reforms. They need to be called not necessarily reforms, but there needs to be some kind of an official statement that this is what we're going to do now. Think about 1978 in China, when Deng Xiaoping made his famous announcement there, or Doi Moi in Vietnam or something. You need to have kind of the official backing from the top leadership in order for those reforms to be real reforms. If they are incremental, if you have to search for them, there's most likely something wrong. And so far, this has been the case in North Korea. Here we have our changes in economic policy that I've talked about, starting with stuff like Chongsan Li method and the Daean system in the 1960s. They count as perfection measures as well, all the way to the latest measures in agriculture or in industry. If you test them against those three conditions that I listed on the previous slide, you see that none of them actually really would count as a reform. Some of them come close. I myself have been very excited about the July 2002 measures when they have been announced, but unfortunately that happened a few months after 9/11, and then geopolitics came into play, and the North Koreans basically started rewinding what they might have started under Kim Jong-il, basically starting in 2003, and from 2005 we have more or less a new conservative turn that became much more visible. Also, in terms of an announcement, again, Kim Jong-il, in my analysis, came closest to announcing something like a reform in North Korea. In January 2001, there was an article in Noldong Shinmun where he was quoted as demanding, new ways to deal with a new environment or something. But this is about it. So my conclusion would be that so far North Korea had many perfection measures, but no actual reforms. So what can external actors, including South Korea, US or EU or India, if you're interested, do to promote reforms in North Korea? Well, this is what has been tried so far. This list is certainly not exhaustive, but I think it kind of includes almost everything that has been done. Diplomacy, sanctions, threats, capacity building. I've been part of some of these efforts about 15 years ago by the European Union, taking place in Pyongyang, in Switzerland, and elsewhere, where we try to just, teach is probably a too big term, but just share our knowledge with the North Koreans on what we think how an economy should be run. This went from very broad macro issues to financial accounting, etc., to enable North Korea to participate more effectively in international commerce. There has been developmental and humanitarian assistance, increasingly facing difficulties due to sanctions, of course. Investment in special economic zones is something that has been really lagging, actually. The South Koreans have been active, the Chinese have been active, the Russians a little bit, but that's almost all. I find that personally very striking, because if you look at, for example, China's economic success, and also the kind of reforms in China there, the special economic zones have really been a key driver. And in the case of North Korea, the West is really very reluctant to follow that same strategy. Well, then we also have, of course, psychological warfare and propaganda also trying to impact North Korean behavior. A problem I see with all of those measures, and in particular with sanctions, is that from my point of view, the goal has not been set correctly. As you see here in red at the bottom of the slide, I think most of them aimed at, well, what I call central planning of change in North Korea, where you set measure A and you expect effect B, and then you wonder why it doesn't work. Like all central planners, by the way, they always wonder why what their expected effects never happen. It's interesting that mankind keeps repeating the same mistake over and over again. So I think if you would rather focus on promoting liberalization and opening of markets in North Korea, then maybe we would be much more successful, also ultimately in achieving denuclearization, than going directly for denuclearization. Like saying, we lift these sanctions only if you give up all your nuclear weapons or something. This is, most people would agree, that's a non-starter. But it's a strategy that nevertheless has been followed for many, many years, although it didn't work. Okay, and here is now my attempt to answer the question of how we can impact the likelihood of reforms in North Korea, having said that all the measures that have been tried so far were not very helpful. I think breaking the problem down into its components will make it much more manageable. If you look at those two equations here, they, like most equations, they look probably a little bit complicated, but they are not. It's actually very, very, very simple. The equation number one says that reform is a function of support and opposition to reform. Right? That's pretty obvious. You either have people who support reforms or who don't. That's it. And support depends on the number of those who support reforms and their relative power in the system. So that's XS times PS. And well, the counterforce would be opponents or reforms of reform, or non-supporters actually, and their relative power in the system. I usually say non-supporters because also those who remain passive count as non-reformers, so to say, but you also have active opponents, of course. And whether you are a supporter or non-supporter of reforms is a function of your perceived gains and losses from reforms and non-reforms, right? So if you expect to benefit from the one or the other option, or if you actually expect to incur a loss from the one or the other option. And this is about it. So as I said, this is no real rocket science, but interestingly, it hasn't really been tried so far. Well, all I see is a discussion of the big question without breaking it down into at least these manageable portions. So that's what we have here in terms of 8 variables in the model. As I just explained, you have this written out here again. You have supporters of reform, the number and their relative power, same for non-supporters. And then the perceived effects. I focus on perceived effects. The actual effects don't really matter. What matters for human behavior is what you think is going to happen or what you think is happening. That's why I add perception here, and then it's gains and losses from reforms and non-reforms. So I think that's pretty easy to understand. Now, I also think that looking at North Korea as one unit is not really helpful. I mean, as I said, it's a society of 25 million, but it's not just a number. It's also that they are very different in terms of their interests, in terms of their power, in terms of how they expect to be affected by the one or the other option, reform or non-reform. This is one way of breaking North Korea's society down into 4 groups: leader, elite, middle class, and people. It's perfectly fine if you disagree with this, if you want to add more groups, or if you want to separate them differently. That really depends also on the question you try to answer. For example, you could divide it into population of cities versus population in the countryside. You could divide it into party members, non-party members. You could divide it into men and women. You could divide it into whatever you like. No problem at all. The key point is that we stop treating North Korea as one unit of analysis, because that very often just doesn't work. In my case, since I broke society down into 4 groups, and then again, middle class could probably be even broken down further. I didn't do that to keep things a bit more simple, but as you see, it is doable. We have 8 times 4, like 32 single issues that we can actually discuss. Now, I do not claim to have the right answer for all those 32 issues, but I do believe that a discussion in this form will yield much better results than discussing the whole question of how to promote reforms in North Korea as only one issue, because it's way too complex. I will share all these slides in PDF with the organizer of this talk. That would also include a number of publications where there are much more details for you if you're really interested in how I came up with this table. That's basically a summary of my results. So I applied this model to leader, elite, middle class, and people, and I looked at various ways to impact single components of the comprehensive reform equation. And I basically roughly divided that in is going to work, that's green, is most likely not going to work, or hard to say, that's yellow or 0 here, right? And if you then look at the balance, and that's what matters here, is that you see for elite and middle class, you have most of the pluses where the chances are the highest for actually working. And the same goes for increasing perceived gains from reforms and increasing perceived losses from non-reform. As you see, for all the other issues, it's a bit divided according to what part of society you look at. As I said, I'm really happy to be challenged on the single components here. The point is to discuss the issue in this form rather than treating it as just one question, because it is much more complex. Okay, and well, obviously I do not have 3 hours or something to talk about everything in detail, so let me just summarize a few key points here before coming to my conclusion. As I've just said, focus on the elite and middle class seems to be the most promising thing to do, and focusing on reforms, gains from reforms and losses from non-reform would be more efficient in terms of using limited resources. I should also say that this model, of course, can not only be used by external forces trying to promote reforms, it can also be used by someone who tries to prevent reforms, or it can be used to understand the actual behavior, for example, of the North Korean leadership in that context. For example, if you see that they decided on an inward orientation of the economy, this could be interpreted as something that creates gains from non-reform for the middle class. Because if more effort is being directed at generating money, power, rent-seeking opportunities, etc., inside of North Korea, that will benefit people who are part of the system and who sit at the right place. Of course, it would also be a problem for others. Same for the strengthening of state control over the economy, and also this crackdown on non-socialist and anti-socialist behavior can be interpreted with the help of this model as an attempt to actually reduce the awareness of alternatives and of the actual reasons for the various outcomes. Okay, so how would that look in more detail for the elite? How to increase the perceived gains from reforms for members of the North Korean elite? Well, something that I think is not being done sufficiently is the promotion of the cases of China and Vietnam, which have been very successful. If you travel to North Korea, if you talk to North Koreans, you will, if you're lucky, be able to have a chance about reforms of socialist countries. There is this speech by Kim Jong-il that is quoted a lot from 1995, where he laid out his lessons of the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe, and that all looks pretty gloomy. What is not really debated that much, that's my impression, in North Korea, is really the successful cases of China and Vietnam, especially from the perspective of the elite. Not just a success as a whole, but what does it mean, for example, for a provincial party secretary? And cases where these people were actually able to really expand their influence, they would make the elite think, right? The same goes for decreasing perceived losses of reforms. The example of Nicolae Ceausescu, who has been shot, of course, is a very extreme case. There are many others where members of the elite in Eastern Europe not just lost their influence, some lost their lives. And that is not very encouraging for North Korean members of the elite in terms of supporting reforms. But there have been other examples as well, and they should probably be promoted, right, as a counterweight. Also, yeah, as I argued, the changing the aim of sanctions towards liberalization and marketization, like making non-reform more costly and also perceivably more costly for the North Korean elite, so that they understand if their leadership does not agree to reforms, it will actually reduce, you know, their opportunities for this and that. Something similar can be applied to the middle class as well. And in the case of the middle class, I think also capacity building really matters a lot, because what do you do with new opportunities if you're unable to use them? That's why capacity building efforts, business related, should be promoted. Very clear, the Chinese are doing this actually without making too much noise about that. If you go to North Korea, if you speak to people who are engaged in business, and even if you're just a passive consumer of all this, you clearly see the Chinese influence. So this is taking place. I think it would not be a problem to have even more of that, to enable the North Korean middle class, you know, to make them ready for actually benefiting from reforms once they take place. And I believe that this would make them stronger supporters of such reforms if they not just understand what's going to come, but also if they understand how they will be able to technically really act and benefit from all this. In the same context, I argue strongly in favor of more economic exchange. As I said earlier, I absolutely do not understand why the West is so reluctant to invest in special economic zones. There are, I think, 29 of them right now in North Korea, and none of our big companies is investing there. Compare that to what happened in the 1980s in Shenzhen in China. It's such a striking contrast, really. And I think we're really missing out on an opportunity. And then again, let me reemphasize, I'm not talking about bringing down the regime in North Korea. Not that I wouldn't mind, but that's not the goal here. The goal is to change the system in order to solve all these problems. And if it means that Kim Jong-un stays in power, why not? You know, if he becomes another Deng Xiaoping of North Korea, fine, you know. Anyway, also in terms of the perceived losses from non-reform, and if you read the quote I highlighted here in blue, this is kind of supporting my argument. I think most North Koreans do not yet understand the actual origin of all their problems. I mean, they see that they do not have enough electricity. They see that there's a lot of corruption. They see that they do not have enough to eat. They see that there is a huge gap between countryside and city, and all the other things. They see political repression. They do not understand where it originally comes from. So the understanding that the system is a problem, I think, is something that could be promoted. If I compare North Korea to East Germany, I note a striking difference in the way how the West is trying to impact public opinion. For example, in East Germany, I've grown up with Western television and West German radio, and part of that was, of course, a policy of my government that allowed that to happen, but also the West German government basically setting up broadcasting stations at the border to East Germany and broadcasting right into East Germany. In the case of North Korea, I do not have the impression that, for example, the South Korean government is too aggressively trying to promote information there. They do rely a little bit on USB sticks and whatnot, but even balloon launching efforts by some South Korean NGOs are actually actively prevented by the South Korean government. Now, they have their good reasons for it, no problem, but I'm just saying the contrast is really striking, and therefore this assessment by a North Korean who left North Korea and is now able to speak in South Korea, I think that's pretty correct, that most people understand there's a problem. They do not know where the problem is coming from. I mean, he formulates it in a more flowery language, like they don't know what their grievance is aimed towards, but it's the same message. I'm also not necessarily a big fan of the term awakening or enlightening. That sounds a bit too heavy for my taste. But in principle, I think you're getting the message here. Okay, so my final slide here to conclude. I do not think that we've seen any reforms in North Korea yet, despite the many measures that have been taken. The system remains unchanged. I do not think that the North Korean leader is committed to real reforms, and frankly, I do not see any way how to change that. because, just in a nutshell, I think he stands to lose a lot from reform. He's not going to gain a lot. And ideas to, for example, offer him an exit strategy to spend the rest of his life on a tropical island. I mean, why should he take that? He's the leader of his own country. I mean, how higher can you actually rise? And he's the autocratic leader, the unchallenged leader. I mean, for every politician, that is, I think, kind of their secret dream, right? Not having to go through elections all the time. So it's really difficult to actually think about something that you can offer Kim Jong-un to become a promoter of reforms, really. That's why I'm saying it's much better to focus on the elite and on the middle class, who have much more to gain from reforms and have much more to lose from non-reforms. Of course, sometimes this has to be explained, and some of these things can also be impacted. Economic sanctions, since I've mentioned them, that's a point that is important to me. They are not completely useless. I'm still very strongly against them because I think they are creating side effects that are just also not, these side effects do not combine with our own ethical moral standards. I mean, they're hurting the weak, right? And in a way, they're also strengthening the state, but that's a different story. But they can be effective if the rationale of those sanctions is changed. If, for example, a sanctions relief is not offered for giving up nuclear weapons, but if it's offered, for example, for, I don't know, opening up economic zones for investment or something like that. And I think you wouldn't really have to push very hard, actually. The North Koreans themselves are very much interested in that. And of course, the final effect would then be denuclearization by making North Korea a stakeholder of stable and friendly relations with the rest of the world. I think this is the best way in the long run and in a sustainable way how this could be achieved. But I think my time is up right now. On the next slide, this is just as a preview. Since I'm going to send those slides to you, these are some of the publications I have on the topic. If you're interested in more details, I'm always more than happy about criticism. So if you read something and you find something that you strongly disagree with, please tell me about it. I'm always willing to learn. I'm always looking for opportunities to sharpen my arguments or to even change my position. And this is how you can reach me. You Google me, then you find my email address. You can also follow me on Twitter at rfrankvienna. But for now, I think this is it. And I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Frank, for this fascinating peep into the North Korean economy and what could be a possible way out to have some stakeholders there who are influential and could perhaps think of some reforms. And you made a very important point that many changes have taken place, but not really economic reforms with those three very key elements which you pointed out. And one can immediately see that in China, those elements happened. And so middle class and elite could be a target. Yes, external action, at least of the West, has been targeted on denuclearization and not really on reforms. That also is very clear. On economic zones, Professor Wegg, even the Kaesong economic zone and these flip-flops of the North Korean leaders, closing it, opening it, and all kinds of things. So that would not generate any confidence in any foreign investor. China has leverage. Kim Jong-un cannot do it to China. But to expect any private investment to risk these 180-degree turns in North Korean policy, I think that is not a practical thought at this moment. And no government is really interested in these investments, because that would really mean propping up Kim Jong-un government, and except perhaps China, I would say that even Russia is not very keen on really propping up Kim Jong-un government. They would be perhaps, uh, as I said, they want roots. They want from link up with South Korea, and they feel that North Korea and the leadership stand in the way. I'll ask just one question. When you said that really it requires change of system, and it is very clear that the system needs to change in North Korea. But the system is inextricably linked with the legitimacy of the party and the leader, which for 3 generations have been pushing that system. In China, it could happen because Mao's legacy was dumped by Deng Xiaoping, and he could create a distance between his policies and Mao's policies. But here, the whole legitimacy of Kim Jong Un is from father and grandfather. So, if a system is to be changed, then the legitimacy of this, and I think now it is in their constitution that the ruler has to be from that blue blooded family. How do you square that circle in your view? Please.
Well, thank you. That's maybe I will start with your last question, because I think it's a very interesting and a very good question, also showing that you obviously understand quite a lot about how North Korea works. The question of how can you do something different from your predecessors without at least implicitly challenging them and thereby hurting your own legitimacy, right? Yes, that is tricky, but the North Koreans have actually been very good at doing this. That's why I mentioned also this article by Kim Jong-il in January 2001. He wrote there, I'm quoting out of my memory, so forgive me if I'm not 100% precise here. He said that, look, guys, things are now different from the 1950s and 60s, and therefore we should approach them differently. And he turned this into some kind of a logical thing to do, like what Kim Il-sung did in the 50s and 60s was 100% perfect for the situation back then. I think he called it the environment or something. Now is a different environment, so of course we have to behave differently, which is not a contradiction compared to what has been done under Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, but it's rather a continuation of the spirit of their policy in response to a new environment. So new policies actually means old policies. And if you're familiar with the North Korean ideology of Juche, the so-called creative principle is actually a core component of it. And that says exactly that. Creative principle means that you need to adjust your behavior according to the situation. So it's not like the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy that was prevalent in the Eastern Bloc, where there was like one correct way of doing things, and if you deviated, you immediately became implicitly an opponent of Marxism-Leninism, and that of course couldn't be. In North Korea, thanks to this creative principle of Juche and the way how it has been applied, it's actually perfectly fine if you do things differently, even compared to what you yourself have done last week. If you can argue that, yeah, but you know, the environment has changed, so I have to adjust to that. And this is appreciated by the North Koreans. They would not regard that as an invitation, you know, for a reform movement or something, which is, of course, the big fear that all those regimes have, including in North Korea. Once you create the impression that some dynamism is happening, then people will demand more and more, and the whole thing will get out of control, as we've seen in the Arab Spring or something. So I fully agree with your concerns. I do believe that the North Koreans have found a very ingenious way of dealing with this contradiction. So they can actually do it. I think it is doable. It really depends on the political will of the leadership, or on the political skill of ideologues and so on. Let me also, perhaps, if I may, comment on the two other remarks that you made. The one on Kaesong Industrial Zone. The problem is that Kaesong is special. I wouldn't really count it even as a special economic zone, because it is a bilateral project. It's not a zone where everybody could invest. It's been a bilateral economic project between South Korea and North Korea. And therefore, I do agree that it did not create much of confidence amongst international investors, but I do not think that it's a good case or a good example, actually. I would rather look at Rason, Rajin Sonbong, as it used to be called in the early 1990s, up in the Northeast. And that is not extremely promising in terms of billions of dollars being made there, but it has been actually much easier for international investors, well, what little there was, of actually working there. And I should say this is also part of what I tried to propose today in my presentation. Why not using economic sanctions to create an environment that is more acceptable to international investors? You know, if, for example, transfer of profits becomes a problem. You had this case of this Egyptian Orascom, this telecommunications company, right, and many others who generated profits in North Korea. They tried to transfer them out of the country, and then suddenly the North Koreans applied some kind of a bizarre exchange rate, basically reducing their profits to very, very small numbers. This is something that can be countered by economic sanctions. And I think in that case, the North Koreans would actually give in. They would respond positively, unlike if you ask for denuclearization. This is exactly what I mean. Using this kind of economic pressure, if necessary, if no other means are available, to improve the environment for international investors. The other remark you made, and that is indeed a dilemma, is wouldn't investment prop up the Kim Jong-un government? Well, yes, of course it would. And I think we should probably ask ourselves whether that is per se a bad thing. You know, it is so easy to become victimized by our own propaganda, and I deliberately call it propaganda, which is obviously a negative term. It's this kind of childish way of doing politics in the United States. At least that's my subjective impression. Like, you know, creating a villain, like, you know, in those Marvel comic books or Hollywood movies, where there is one bad guy. Think about, for example, Saddam Hussein or Muammar al-Gaddafi, or yeah, Hitler, of course, was the original for all these things, right? You create one villain, and this person is then really evil, and even speaking to that person is unthinkable. Think about the debate around Trump's meetings with Kim Jong-un and so on. I can understand that on a very, very unsophisticated emotional level of a child, but how political analysts and governments can actually follow that, that's very difficult for me to understand. At the end of the day, whatever Kim Jong-un is personally, he's the leader of North Korea, and that's what matters to us. And that's why talking to him and maybe doing something that's beneficial for him is not a problem per se. The problem is what he does with that. So if that leads to more violations of human rights, that's a problem. If that leads to an expansion of the North Korean nuclear program, that is a problem. But propping up the regime as such, from an analytical perspective, is not a problem per se, unless it leads to all those undesired effects. So I think we should also kind of step out of that box, out of this trap that we've created for ourselves of regarding systems as being represented by just one person, and then giving a system kind of human characteristics. It's a bad country, it's an evil country. That's impossible. A person can be bad and evil. And if you look around you, even that is not really true. People are much more complex, right? I think it's a very important question to be discussed. And I think we should also liberate ourselves a little bit from our own overly simplified Hollywood style preconceptions. And that would certainly also help us to be much more creative and productive and effective in our foreign policy. But I fully agree with you that this is a concern that needs to be addressed and also be taken into consideration. Because at the end of the day, if you have the media, if you have public opinion, we are democracies. So as a leader in a democracy, of course, you cannot act against public opinion. So that, of course, limits the scope of action that we have. That's one of the benefits I have as a scholar. You know, I can come up with all these brilliant ideas without having to worry about, you know, how realistic it is to implement them. But Anyway, the problem is clearly there, and I think you're absolutely right.
Thanks, Professor Frank. But your remarks have a very compelling logic, let me assure you. We have seen that demonization of a leader in, as you mentioned, Saddam Hussein in Libya, etc., has led those countries to. But the floor is now open, and let me request Professor Sandeep Mishra to kick off. Sandeep, please.
Hello. It was really learning to listen you. Your very comprehensive presentation, and I think, but my problem is that probably whatever tools we have to understand North Korea, all those tools are basically based on, like, suppose when you say that we categorize system into, say, elite and middle class, and so that way we can categorize, but how they are connected to one another, all the models which we are having, they may not be implicated, like, say, they could not be implemented to North Korea as such. Why I'm saying so? Because many people say that in North Korea is such a closed country that like, say, we don't feel that any mass uprising or, say, mass demand for any reform or any change is going to happen. Then we are now, like, as you have presented, that you are saying that 5 million, you can say, middle class and 10,000 elites, we can target them. But again, how much you can say capacity, how much you can say, one, how we are going to access them, that's one problem. Two, even if we access them through, say, bilateral mechanism or international organization, whether they have any mechanism to influence the overall decision-making body in North Korea. Because ultimately, I think that's going to be so. Don't you feel that whatever tools we have to understand North Korea and make suggestions about possible changes in North Korea, they sometimes are not able to be very effective because the system of North Korea is quite extraordinary. I'm not saying bad or good. I'm not making, because I'm not saying we may have reservation, but according to estimates, almost 1/3 of North Korean GNP goes on defense. That's not a, you can say, that's not a normal situation. So I'm saying that since this is a special case, whether our approach to target middle class and elites and through them try to introduce some reform idea in North Korea, is it going to be a viable option? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, you're touching upon a number of very, very important and big questions, and let me try to address some of them, if I may. One is, that's a topic that's very important to me as a scholar. I very often encounter this idea that, yeah, this model only works for this or that type of country. I should say then it's a bad model. When we talk about models and theories in social science, including economics, political science, international relations, and so on, then we talk about meta theories, and the meta theory, it either works or not, and you cannot apply it selectively. Then it's a bad theory. Then the theory needs to be developed further. Very often it depends on the level of abstraction that we choose. Of course, every single society is different. North Korea is different from India. India is different from Austria. And I could speak for hours about differences between Austria and Germany. I'm German living in Austria now for almost 20 years, and you would think they are the same, but they are not. So of course, every society is different and societies are complex. But on a certain level, I think we do have a pretty good understanding of how things work. And I strongly oppose the idea that North Korea is different. North Korea is not a country inhabited by some strange organisms on Mars. North Korea is a country on Earth, in East Asia, inhabited by human beings who, by the way, happen to be Koreans. And so we do understand quite a bit how Koreans, for example, in terms of their history and culture and everything that shapes their behavior, differ, for example, from Japanese and Chinese. And of course, the North Koreans differ from the South Koreans, thanks to the past 80 years of development. But that really depends on what level of analysis you choose. On a higher level of abstraction, I do believe that North Korea is just another country and just another society, another economy, another player in geopolitics. being endowed with its own level of natural resources, labor, economic power, military power, soft power, and so on. And that, of course, differs, having its own type of political system. But in principle, it can be understood. And I do believe that it can also be understood by looking at state socialism as a concept. Now, no two state socialist countries have been the same, but that's why I pointed at Kornai at his kind of main line of causality. On that level, I think we can understand North Korea. And this is also leading to the second question or remark that you had. My optimism concerning our ability to really have an impact comes from this empirical experience of change in the older socialist system. What has been done? Single measures have been tried. They didn't lead to very much. But what has been tried is, in the long run, what I just talked about. An environment has been created for cooperation. Offers have been made, options have been created. If you think, for example, about attempts to involve Eastern European countries into foreign trade, even enforcing an arms race upon them, which finally broke the back of the Soviet Union economically, all these things, they have been tried. I once said in a very, well, informal way, why don't we just drown them in US dollars and then just wait what happens, you know? This is why I argued so strongly against the central planning of change in North Korea. Like, if we give them $1 million, what will happen with that $1 million? That's not how it works. We need to have a bit more of a confidence in our own system that obviously has worked in the past. Send them all those millions of dollars, make sure the money stays inside of the country and doesn't flow out to Switzerland. That would be a problem. And then just wait for corruption to emerge, which will, of course, challenge the very idea of an equality-based society that is prevalent in North Korea. Wait for more demand to emerge as a result of more money in circulation. Demand creates supply that will strengthen the market forces and so on. More money in individual hands will create more individual power. Now, we know that more individual economic power is usually very helpful for creating political interest as well. If you're busy just staying alive on a daily basis, you do not care much about political questions. But if you are operating a company of 200, 300, 400 people, suddenly you realize how you get in conflict with your government, and then you try to mitigate that somehow. And on Kim Jong-un himself, well, he's just one person. He does depend on support from the elite in particular, and from the middle class. They do support him, very obviously,
5 o'clock.
and they do so, you know, to serve their own interests. So, and that is what my model is actually suggesting. If you're able to change their interest in a way that they would benefit from reforms, they might use their influence one way or the other. They know best how to do that. None of us knows. We're not part of the North Korean elite. And then I think they might actually be also able to convince Kim Jong-un to take the necessary steps, because the alternative would be that, you know, he would have a tragic accident or something and would be replaced by someone who is more willing. Again, I'm not making this up. It has happened 100 times in human history, right? We had autocratic, totalitarian systems before, and we also saw how they actually have been changed. So this is something that I actually do see can work. Okay, let me see. But any mechanism to enforce? Yes, that's what I just talked about. Of course, it will not work in a direct way, like 10 people from the elite knocking on the door of Kim Jong-un and reading a document and demanding him to do something. Maybe that's not the best way. That's a good way to end up being executed. But the idea that he can rule without support from anybody, I think that's not correct. He does need the elite support. In a way, that was the rationale behind some of the earlier sanctions, which were very ridiculous, by the way. If you remember, there was a prohibition on exporting French cognac to North Korea. And that was based on the idea that Kim Jong-il at that time needs French cognac to keep the members of his elite loyal. Of course, that is bullshit. but he does need to keep the members of his elite loyal. That is absolutely true. Not just, but not through French cognac, but by other means. And yeah, I hope I was able to at least partially answer your questions. But
Thanks.
they were very good, actually. Yeah.
There are some very interesting questions in our chat box. I'll go one by one. One by Professor Hemant Adlakha. He says that reforms are really dependent on some kind of stability in Korean Peninsula. And there, US seems to be playing a negative role. That peace by punishment is their preferred way of working. And I can add that yes, US seems to be restraining South Korea at present, because at least the Moon regime perhaps wants to have some closer economic relationship, contacts, cooperation, collaboration with North Korea. And it seems to us here that US is restraining South Korea. So is US is playing a negative role in this whole process? What are your comments on US's negative role in the way US is dealing with North Korea in introducing these changes?
Wow, again, a very good question, and thanks for giving me a chance to talk about this aspect as well, because it really touches upon another key issue here. It's not about Korea. It looks as if it is, but it is not. I mean, frankly, who cares about Korea? Except for the Koreans and the immediate neighbors. For everybody else, it's a means to an end. And when we look at the Korean Peninsula right now, it is going back to a place where it used to be. And that is the kind of the front line between two systems, two enemies, two adversaries, however you like to call it, in the Cold War. And that's why I mentioned Cold War 2.0. So to answer the question, whatever the US does on the Korean Peninsula, I think, does not necessarily always only have to do with North Korea. I think it's about China. And the US is certainly not interested in a situation where a unified Korea might become an ally of the Chinese. We might at some point arrive at such a situation. Remember, Donald Trump made similar remarks, or if you look back at Jimmy Carter, who thought about withdrawing American troops from South Korea already back in the 1970s. Or if you go even further back to the Acheson Doctrine of January 1950, where I think the US Secretary of State said that the US defense perimeter is actually running across the line between Japan and South Korea. In that case, if the Americans, how to say, give up the Korean Peninsula, then they will just, stop caring. But so far, if the South Korean government does something that does not correspond with the US policy, it might lead to a situation where China will step in, and the Americans don't really want that. I think they right now benefit from the status quo. Interestingly enough, I think China also benefits from the status quo. That's why China isn't exerting more pressure on the North Koreans, actually, because they can't really be sure about the outcome of such a process. This is very dynamic, so it might change anytime soon. But so far, I wouldn't say that the US is trying to prevent a solution on the Korean Peninsula for the sake of North Korea. I think they are more interested in not creating a disadvantageous strategic situation in the context of their relationship with China in the whole East Asian region. And well, they have many other interests, right? There is Taiwan, there is the South China Sea, there are the Philippines, and Japan, and all the rest of it. There has been this pivot to Asia by Barack Obama, also showing a renewed US strategic interest. I think India was also indirectly at least involved in that, with the idea that India could serve as a balancer to do the American job to keep the Chinese busy or something. I'm simplifying here. So, and I look at the whole Korean issue as actually part of that problem. So by looking for a solution from this international relations perspective, looking for a solution by only looking at North Korea will lead us to nowhere, because that's not the question. The question is not North Korea. It is for South Korea, It might be for Japan a little bit, but for the US, it's not about Korea. It's about Korea in the context of geopolitics in East Asia, and that's how it should be approached.
Thanks, very interesting. We have one question from Professor Vijayanti Raghavan regarding North Korea's participation at COP26 in Glasgow. And they made all the right noises, but I think all the power in North Korea is from coal. So whether there's some corrective, they made some promises. I have not read that speech, but perhaps they made some promises. So are some corrective measures expected in your view in North Korea?
Well, you see me smiling because I really love that topic. The North Koreans are extremely clever people. I mean, not all of them, but you know, some of their top bureaucrats and policymakers, and they have understood that they can just make a hell lot of money with this. You know, by, for example, selling carbon dioxide certificates globally, or by circumventing sanctions by, for example, covering up investments as environmental protection measures. I mean, these are their two main objectives, right? To make money and to break out of international isolation. And they will use these opportunities very skillfully, as they have done in the past. Now, North Korea does produce a lot of coal, a lot of its energy from coal, that's right. But they also have many hydroelectric power stations. Actually, already starting under the Japanese colonial period, North Korea is actually very well suitable for that. In the last years, they've actually even increased their efforts in this regard. So, and they argued, for example, the 1994 Framework Agreement to solve the first nuclear crisis included building 2 light water reactors. Until the nuclear test of 2006, the North Koreans always argued that they have a nuclear program for civilian reasons, because they need to resolve their energy crisis. And I think this renewed international emphasis on clean energy, and the North Koreans will be very carefully following what's happening in Europe at the moment. France promoting the idea of nuclear energy counting as green energy. Germany is kind of about to join. I'm reluctant to say more on that because I'm not really an expert, but that's the impression I get from the media. Then the North Koreans will perhaps have a renewed effort at, you know, the building nuclear power stations and then asking for international support, etc. So yeah, they make all the right noises, and I think they know what they are doing. This is, again, this is about making money. It's about circumventing sanctions, and it's also about kind of returning back to the stage of international diplomacy, more or less through the back door, because they have so far been denied this kind of access, and they want to have it back. So from their perspective, it all makes a lot of sense. And final sentence on this: at a time when tourism was still possible to North Korea, one of the ways how the North Koreans promoted tourist trips to North Korea vis-a-vis Chinese customers was actually saying, if you want to breathe clean air, come over to our country because yours is so polluted. So they are extremely good at using this kind of stuff.
Thanks, quite interesting. We have one question from Dr. Jojin John, that how do you reach out to the elite and middle classes in North Korea? It is a monolithic system, and you were mentioning South Korea, for its own reasons, is not really broadcasting in their different ways because they are caught in their own contradictions. So how do you reach out to the elite in North Korea and the middle classes?
Well, as I said, it's we should abstain from central planning of change. So, you know, thinking about how to address single people with single measures, I think this will lead to nowhere. But there are endless ways how we could actually do this. Again, we could try to just promote investment opportunities. We could open ourselves up to trade. We could enable North Korean delegations to participate in international meetings. Like, you know, Copenhagen has just been mentioned. There should be more of that, because it's not Kim Jong-un who is going there. It's the elite who is going there. And they are learning. They are intelligent people. They have somehow managed to, you know, move up to the highest ranks in North Korea. So they must be capable of something, right? When we talk about informing them, I'm not speaking about sending each of them a personal letter. Just make information available and leave it to them to actually consume it or not. just create more of an availability. And so far, my impression is that the availability of outside information in North Korea is very low. Yes, of course, this is partly due to the policy of the North Korean government. When I was a student there, I think now I can say that I illegally brought in a radio that could be freely tuned, and all I found when I tuned in were very strong signals disturbing all kinds of radio stations or something. But this can be circumvented. There are satellites. You can shower the country with receiving systems and so on and so on. Also, perhaps on a side note, but also related to this, as an East German, I knew that if I would leave the country, I would be welcomed with open arms in West Germany. And there were literally millions of East Germans who went to West Germany before German unification. Whereas in the case of North Korea, we have roughly over 30,000 people who went from North Korea to South Korea since 1953. And they are not really welcomed with open arms. They are accepted kind of reluctantly and put in a quasi-detention facility and so on and so on. So this is something that the South Korean government, for example, could do. Also, in terms of addressing the elite, why not passing a law in South Korea, in the National Assembly, saying that after unification, every North Korean military officer will be able to retain his position and rank in the military with just very few exceptions. Why not passing a law in the South Korean National Assembly specifying how after unification they will deal with members of the Joseon Noreongdang, the Korean Workers' Party? Most importantly, saying that these people will not all be punished for just being a member of the party. This is not known yet, right? And this kind of law has not been passed yet. And trust me, once such a law is passed, you don't have to worry. The North Korean elite will learn about it, right? This is what I mean. Do not address them personally and directly, but create information and make it accessible that is of interest to them, and then leave it to them to actually get it. There are means and ways of getting this kind of information, right? Also on make more public kind of initiatives, that might benefit the elite, offers for investment, etc. And then let Kim Jong-un refuse that. And so the elite needs to see, okay, these offers have been made that would have been so fantastic for us. And here's our leader who said no. They will accept that once, they will accept it twice, they will maybe accept it 121 times. The 122nd time, they will be sick and tired of it. And they will start, creating pressure within the system that they comprise of. I mean, they are the system, right? They know how it works. This is what I mean by addressing the elite and the middle class, not directly going there and preaching to them, but rather creating this kind of opportunities.
Thanks. Quite a practical way of cracking the problem. We have one question from Dr. Venkataraman. He says that could there be some kind of a scaling of reforms which could be acceptable for the regime and also viable to achieve the desired results? Like SEZ, for instance, was a kind of a reform in China in a very small scale, and that got scaled up. So is it possible to look at it in that way?
Absolutely. I strongly support that. There is this one sentence that you find in many publications on reforms: success breeds success. So you start with one measure. If that measure works, it will actually encourage the involved actors to do more. And that's why I'm so unhappy about how the special economic zone issue has gone. So many new special economic zones have been created under Kim Jong-un, and none of them has been successful. Partly, of course, because the North Korean system is what it is, and it is not very inviting to foreign investors, but also partly because we simply didn't go there, because you can now not even transfer $10 or something to North Korea without instantly running into trouble with your bank and with American financial supervisory authorities and so on and so on. So in a way, we are standing in the way of our own success. I do believe that a gradual approach is possible. I actually think the North Koreans have tried something like this. They tried to introduce a hybrid system. Look at food, for example. You remember in the very old days, they had a rationing system where Mr. Kim or Park or Che or Lee or whatever would get the full ration he would need from the state. Then they lowered that ration and at the same time liberalized a little bit the market for agricultural products. So people still got some of their food from the state, but they were also able to purchase a little bit from the markets and to kind of supplement their diet through market means. So you had the hybrid system. You still had the state supply system for food at very low, highly state subsidized prices distributed through the public distribution system. And on the other hand, you had the incentive system created through a market where prices could be set freely, where farmers could more decide what to produce at what price to sell. And that would at some point lead to an increase in output because farmers have more of an incentive to produce more. And then you can actually even lower the share of your food ration distributed by the state and increase the share distributed by the market because prices will go down, income levels will go up. And then at the end of this state process, the state might actually not have to engage in food distribution at all, which is why, by the way, I think we should also not always look at the lower food ration as a bad sign. Right now it is. But in the situation like in the early 2000s, when we were in the middle of these little experiments with perfection measures, I think it was actually perhaps a good sign because it showed that the state trusted more the market to provide the missing food that people would not get from the state system. Of course, that is dead now for a number of reasons, but that's how it could work. So success breeds success, and introducing a hybrid system rather than having a big bang approach as Jeffrey Sachs had promoted it for the Soviet Union, that is something that's going to work, I think.
Thanks, Dr. Frank. We are approaching 5 o'clock, so I'll just take one more question and after that request Professor Sandeep Mishra to conclude. Dr. Om Prakash Kumar asked that whether the ideology stands in the way of, if I got it right, of economic reforms, and if the North Koreans keep on concentrating on diverting resources to nuclear program, etc., can really economic reforms happen?
That kind of depends on what you think they will do with their nuclear program. I know this is a very controversial topic, and it's even a bit risky to even think about this aloud, but what's the problem with North Korea expanding its nuclear program? If we think this will eventually lead to an attack by North Korea on another country, yes, then it's a problem. If we expect that this eventually lead to nuclear proliferation, yes, then it's going to be a problem. If we expect this to lead to other countries following the North Korean example by seeing that the country has not been punished, so why shouldn't they also have their nuclear weapons? Yes, then it's a problem. So I think we should focus on preventing that. If we manage to achieve this, and this is something that is in our control, then I think we could actually let them do whatever they want to do, divert their resources. At the same time, make sure, and that's why I also talked about informing the people about the consequences of non-reform. At the same time, making sure that people in North Korea, the elite and the middle class, understand that they are missing out on something, that this continuous expansion of the nuclear program is actually hurting their interest. That will also lead to reforms, I think. It will build up the necessary pressure. Let me just share one experience I had when I was traveling in North Korea, as long as this still let me. A North Korean gentleman talked to me one-on-one. There were no witnesses, and it was dark outside, and we were in an isolated spot. And he said, well, why do you think do we need this nuclear and missile program? You've seen the conditions of our roads and of our infrastructure. Wouldn't it be much better if our government would invest this money into this rather than wasting it on nuclear weapons? frankly, I was shocked. I didn't really know what to say. I thought, okay, is this guy real, or is it an agent provocateur, who has been sent to test me and to test my reaction? Okay, we had, I think, 2 or 3 beers already. That's true as well. But what I'm trying to say is this kind of thoughts is already there, right? And well, they will not immediately lead to change. When I lived in East Germany in the early 1980s, hardly anybody supported the system anymore. And still it took another 8 or 9 years before it finally collapsed. So the non-support of the system and the momentum for reform needs to be there first. And then you need to have like the right spark that will trigger such a change. It's not a linear process, but I'm pretty confident that it is going to happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank. Absolutely fascinating. Professor Sandeep Mishra, would you like to make some concluding remarks and close the session?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Tyal. It's my pleasure, actually. In a very short notice, I reached to Professor Richard Frank, and he agreed to talk to us. It's a privilege for us because actually we don't have much detailed discussion about North Korea. There are some stereotypes about North Korea which have been debated in Indian intellectual, you can say, circles. So it's good that we had chance to listen to you. And I think our students, other fellow professors, and many former diplomats, they had some conversation, and this conversation is going to be with them for some time. So it's my pleasure. I really thank you for accepting our invitation and giving us time on behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies also. And I hope that this is not going to be a one-time affair. We are going to reach out to you again and again and keep you involved with our ICS and Indian academia. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for
everybody.
the invitation. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will send you a PDF of my presentation that you
Okay.
can then share amongst everybody.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Thank
you very much. Thank you, Prof.